Alright, so here I am a few days later. I just completed the Emerald Tablets of Thoth-The Atlantean. This book right here. And I did a little more research on my YouTube account and I figured out how to extend the length of my videos past 15 minutes. So, this video will contain a lot of the Emerald Tablet, the writings after the Emerald Tablet that are in the book transcribed by Doriel, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth-The Atlantean. Okay, so the additional content includes 2 tablets not printed previously, a facsimile of original tablet's cover, a map of Atlantis, 3 articles on Atlantis by Doriel, which includes The Secrets of Atlantis, Atlantis and Lemuria, and Atlantis and its part in the New Age. So, starting off, I will be reading, as soon as I find my place, I will be reading the, okay, it says additional information on the secrets of Atlantis and its time by Doriel. Alright, this is Article 1 in the back of the book. It says, The Secrets of Atlantis. The Secrets of Atlantis by Dr. Doriel. By a great many people, Atlantis is looked on as a legendary continent which never had real existence. The only account we have of Atlantis is the one by Plato in his dialogue with Timaeus, where he says his grandfather was told by the Egyptian priests that their ancestors came from a land in the Western Ocean. This was supposed to have been destroyed by the sinking of the land some 12,000 years ago. It is true that few traces of their culture can be found today, but the Atlanteans left records that are still preserved by the wisdom schools. The wisdom schools, that is a term not very loosely used in the occult today. However, the wisdom schools would be a synonym for the mystery schools. The sinking of Atlantis was the source of the universal legends of a deluge as recorded in the Old Testament and in the folklore of almost every race in the world. The ancient records of Atlantis tell us that the sinking of Atlantis was brought about because the souls of the Atlanteans, who had developed such a tremendous knowledge about the cosmic and natural laws, had passed on to a higher plane. Atlanteans of the last days were mostly souls that were low in the scale of development, yet they had access to the mighty science developed by their ancestors. This science was so great that if used improperly, it could have destroyed the world. The people had deteriorated until they were no longer worthy to have access to the vast knowledge and wisdom that they had inherited from their ancestors. The souls that occupied the bodies of those in a latter period of the Atlantean age were souls that were low in development. By the end of the Atlantean age, great advances had been made in the sciences and the arts. For instance, they had developed flying machines that were capable of tremendous speeds, able to fly to the moon and back, and encircle the world in an hour or less. These ships were of a very light metal, similar to aluminum, but much harder than steel. They were very magnetic and susceptible to the magnetic currents of Earth and of the space. They were made of an alloy obtained by the action of sodium on Seki chloride of chromium. Subjected to electrical and magnetic stress, they were not affected by heat or cold, and even at cruising speed, capable of traveling 1,000 miles an hour or more. They were powered by a helix of 7 wires, the central one the greatest in diameter. Each alternate was coiled in an opposite direction. These were collectors of magnetic current. Two 12-foot antennae on the outside of the ship were connected to the wires of 2 helixes. These wires extended to the inner wall of the ship and were coiled in opposite directions around the ship over its entire length. The 7 wires of each standard extended in radiation, those of one crossing those of the others, and those of one crossing those of the others, and were wound around the entire body of the ship as a core, which could be turned or moved in any direction on bearings. The current could be slowed or speeded up in its through movement through these coils, thus advancing or retarding the speed of the ship or its distance from the Earth. Each ship projected around itself a field force. I don't know why I didn't say force field. A field force which prevented friction of the air from acting upon the ship. Also, through the use of their advanced science, they were able to suspend the gravity within the ship so that those who were on it were not affected by the tremendous speeds that it attained. With such ships, sailing vessels on the seas were unnecessary, for they were able to go to their far-flung colonies very quickly and without effort on their part. The buildings of Atlantis, as of their colonies, were not composed of bricks and stones and metal, as of those of latter day, but were created by fixing patterns of force in suspension and attracting around them vortices of cosmic dust. By the use of complicated patterns, they were able to form or create great buildings in a matter of seconds, and these remained intact until the pattern around which they were formed was dissolved by the builders. It is for this reason that we do not find monumental remains of the ancient Atlanteans in the various parts of the world where their colonies had been built. When the Atlanteans passed, so also the patterns which they had set up were dissolved and their buildings. The great cities vanished from the face of the earth with the exception of a few artifacts which had been created from the natural materials of their earth as hobbies by those who desired to maintain some of the arts of the ancient times. They had 12 months of 28 days and one of 29 for 3 years, and every 4th year one of 30. Their religion was the adoration of the principle of spiritual life, which they called Denze Menze. Their priests were called the Deltzana. Punishment for crimes against the state was invariably exile from the motherland and her colonies for varying periods of time. There was a complete equality of sexes in civil life, any person of any age or sex being able to hold office in any of the positions either of the civil government or of the priestly castes. It says caste, which would be a case, but it really means class. So the priestly class. Education was free but compulsory for all, for it was considered that one who did not have knowledge could not live life to its fullest. Their philosophy encompassed time, space, and life, 3 infinitely related elements cooperating, eternal, immaterial, unchanging, in their relative condition of cooperation and codependence on the infinite cycle of existence. The basic principles of their belief included the over-spirit, the source of animation, the immaterial form covering the spiritual, the material form covering the immaterial, the magnetic principle in universal creation, the electric principle in universal creation, the infinite mind manifest in time, space, and light, the developing principle in universal creation. They taught that nothing exists without an infinite counterpart, and nothing comes into existence without the ruling of specific natural law. On one of the islands was a great temple built in the form of a pyramid. This was on the island called Unal. It was beneath this temple that the halls of Amenti, which are spoken of in the Emerald Tablets, was found, and it was there that the seven lords of the cycles had their manifestation. This temple was not a temple of worship in the strictest sense of the word, but rather it was a focal point upon this earth of all of the divine wisdom of the cosmic consciousness of God, or God. There was another island called Undal, upon which these great mystery schools were formed, and it was there that all of those who passed beyond the ordinary schools of Atlantis went for instruction in the great mysteries of light and spirit. And it was there that the wise men of other races and nations of the earth came for instructions according as they were able to receive, to carry back to their own countries and peoples knowledge and wisdom which later on was incorporated into their folklore and mythology of the descendants. Those races have been forgotten by present-day man. Beneath the earth, the same islands were inhabited by the serpent race with the bodies of man and the heads of great serpents. Though these serpents had the hypnotic power of causing their heads to assume that of any human being or form. Thus, in the latter days, though they had been almost destroyed and exterminated by the great Atlantean race, the few survivors gradually began to insinuate themselves into the places of the rulers of Atlantis, killing them and assuming their form and features so that it became necessary for a means to be developed, attesting as to whether one were a true man or the serpent race. The wise men evolved a word which could only be pronounced by human vocal cords and not by those of the snake people. That word was Kininigan. Kininigan. It's spelled Kininigan. Kininigan. And it is still a great dispeller of illusion. Once each year the rulers of Atlantis stood before the people assembled and pronounced the word so that they could know that they were ruled by their own kind. It is from the knowledge of the hypnotic power of the serpent race and their battle against mankind that we have the legends of warfare between man and the old serpents, and the legends that the serpent has hypnotic power. It was not the snake that we have today, but the serpent that walks like a man. The old serpent race of Atlantis, that man considered the ultimate of evil, gave rise to the legend of the serpent tempting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The wise men of Atlantis had developed great powers and the forces which are known at the present time. In them the third eye was open. The greater part of the people could communicate with each other through the means of telepathy. They had knowledge of the molding force of creation, which they used in the construction of their buildings and implements. That force was called Zeril, the molding force of creation. The Atlanteans had great libraries in which books recording the history of a 500,000 years could be found. But those books are not like the books which we read today. They were very small boxes, each one with a small lens and a series of projecting studs or switches powered by a tiny atomic motor, from which could be projected the actual three-dimensional replica of historical events, scenes which had occurred in the far past. Stories were acted out and could be projected so that they seemed to appear in the air before the seer as if they were actual solid material form. All of the wisdom and the knowledge that had been gained was thus preserved and was accessible to all. Many evil and ancient beliefs in magic derived from the legends of this time were only the remnants of the great science of the Atlanteans and those who preceded it. So-called magic is only unknown science which has been lost and forgotten by modern man. Let me repeat that. So-called magic is only unknown science which has been lost and forgotten by modern man. Let that sink in, how much of the old science and ways have actually been lost. So the cross was a great symbol in ancient Atlantis. It was considered as a symbol of the earthly Eden from which 4 rivers flowed. This Eden and rivers symbolically had reference to the 4 divine principles or powers known and used by the Atlanteans. All the natural powers exercised by the Atlanteans depended upon the use of the etheric forces which they called mana, because they were in great part controlled by the mental powers. This force later became related to Manas, the mind of the Hindu yoga. Mana, or etheric essence, is a tremendous force, all-pervading, which may be tapped to supply illimitable energy. All so-called miracles are accomplished by conscious or unconscious tapping of this energy. In this case, a sympathetic attunement is made. This knowledge, degraded, was the basis of all ancient sympathetic magic. Because space was filled with this mysterious essence, which is subdivided into an almost countless number of kinds, the study of the heavens was undertaken to find the key to its releasement. This was the true origin of astrology and astronomy. In ancient times, the astrologer could use a heaven chart as a means of tapping an inexhaustible reservoir for, sympathetically, an individual born under a certain configuration of the heavens was attuned with the definite divisions or kinds of this etheric energy under the sympathetic vibration of law. It was for this reason that the Atlanteans developed special guilds born under different signs for the control of the 12 major divisions of the etheric energy. There was on Atlantis the golden race, the black race, the white race, the blue race, the green race, and a red race. Many of the races of modern times are descended from the mixtures of the various races of Atlantis, which were scattered over the earth after the sinking of the motherland. Many of the colonies remaining were small in number, surrounded by barbarous races of tremendous strength, and eventually were absorbed into those barbarous races, but in being absorbed left their imprint in the color, the skin, some racial configurations, and in some knowledge that they were able to impart even to the savage races. The temple was sealed that still exists, buried through the silent ages at the bottom of the ocean. But in time to come, Atlantis will rise again. The great temple will be unfolded to the world with all of its mighty wisdom and secrets, but this will not occur until the golden age of man has dawned again. Man arising from the bondage to the beast will have taken his true Man arising from his bondage to the beast will have taken his true place amongst the stars. At that time, the Christ kingdom will be established upon the earth. In the monumental remains, great cities of the past, such as Tiahuanaco in South America, and in great structures of the Caroline Islands, we see the traces of a vast knowledge that man once had. When we read in Irish mythology of the Tuatha Dé the great people of ancient Ireland, we are reading of the Atlantean colonies which existed in Ireland until a period of some 5,000 years ago. Men who had powers to fly through the air, travel under the water, disintegrate the atom, and do many things that are unknown to our present science. But the great ones have passed, and the knowledge that they had once had comes to us only faintly through legends and folklore of all of the races of the earth, because Atlantis left its imprint on all of the races and all of the religions of the ancient world. It is for that reason that the legend of Adam, the man of the red earth, is found amongst all the races of people, every part of the world. It is for that reason that certain universal symbols, such as a cross or the swastika, have been found in every land on every large island, and even in most remote places of the earth, because there was no spot so remote that the Atlanteans did not penetrate with their wisdom. There were no races so savage that some knowledge had not retained by them, and the things that they had been taught by those of their ancient people who had been instructed on the island of Undal. And apparently that is the completion of the article The Secrets of Atlantis by Dr. Doriel. And after the article, it shows a map of Atlantis, and I'll put that up right here. It says Map of Islands of Atlantis, and then you can see North America right there, and then I think that says Greenland, and over here is Europe, Africa, South America, and then they're saying that Atlantis, took up a good part of the Atlantic Ocean, like over in here. Here's, I think that says, what does it say? It says Anatolia, and then Atlantis, and then it shows all the names of the islands. So here's what Atlantis would have looked like in the book or whatever. And then it shows you those names. I'll read those names to you. Okay, so it basically, that's the map that's in the book. And then it says Atlantis, map of Atlantis, map of islands of Atlantis. Then it gives the names. Atlantis, island number 1 was Suntao. Island number 2 was Triala. Island number 3 was Nemina. Number 4 was Undal, which has been mentioned in the book several times. Number 5, Corial. Number 6, Horia. Number 7, Tracia. Number 8, Mania. Number 9, Moria, like M-U-R-I-A. And then number 10, Yog Sog Thoth. And then it says Island X was a created island, and that island is Unao. You see that right there? Where it says right there, it says Unao was a created island. Okay, so moving on, the next article is Atlantis and Lemuria by Dr. Doriel. Okay, so it says Atlantis and Lemuria by Dr. Doriel. This is the second article from the special hardback edition of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. In legend, it is said that there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean a great race who lived on a continent or a group of islands which now have as the sole remaining part above water the Azores Islands. That group of islands were called Atlantis, from which name our Atlantic Ocean was derived. Modern historical records only go back some 5,000 or 6,000 years. According to the chronology as given in the Bible, the world was created only a little over 5,000 years ago. I have read manuscripts which were written a lot earlier than that, and I am convinced that the world has existed for many more than 5,000 years. So even the author himself is pretty much stating that he believes he believes the world is a lot older than what even the Bible says. So, about the only record that we have of Atlantis is found in the dialogue of Timaeus by Plato. In it, he tells that his grandfather heard from the Chaldean priests about the continent or group of islands which once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, and that the ancient Egyptians were immigrants or colonists. He says that there was a circle of water and then a land circle, then another mass of water and land mass. He said that according to the legend of the ancient Egyptians, the god of the sea, who created Atlantis, had a place upon which he built a palace for a human woman whom he loved, and that he surrounded his place by alternate circles of land and water, and that on these different circles he placed people, and that they were ruled by the sons of Neptune and Poseidon, the sea god, and this human woman. Briefly right there, it mentions Poseidon, and that has a lot to do with Hermes. Okay, according to Plato's dialogue by Timaeus, Atlantis was the home of all wisdom and culture, and we are even told that the gods of ancient Greek and Roman mythology were nothing more or less than Atlantean kings or rulers, such as Atlas, who was an Atlantean. According to the Chaldeans, Atlantis had been destroyed in a great cataclysm some 10,000 years before their time. Then again, if we examine the legends of the Mayas of South and Central America, we find among other names the people of Atlan, or children of Atlantis. We know also that they have many legends about the existence of a motherland from which their ancestors came. It is true that one of the Catholic bishops destroyed all of the written records of the Mayas, and that he could get his hands on. So you've had record and book burning forever. As long as there's been uh, any form of tyranny, they've tried to you know restrict knowledge from being passed around. Atlantis existed and was a great civilization. It was destroyed about 52,000 years ago. The great deluge mentioned in the Bible was the result of the sinking of Atlantean and Lemurian continents. There are indications in South America of the existence of a great civilization. The Mayans today have a mathematical system which is far superior to that which is taught in our schools and colleges in America. Certain very fine calculations can be made from the Mayan mathematical system. Better than from our system, they also had considerable knowledge of architecture, which doesn't surprise me. Some people say they were not civilized because they did not use a wheel on carts, but used sledges instead. To the Mayans, a wheel symbolized a circle of light or infinity, and they would not use it for any material thing, believing it should not be desecrated. So the circle was a holy symbol to the Mayans. For that reason, they lacked certain of the mechanical instruments which we have. The Greek alphabet from Alpha to Omega is nothing more or less than a collection of Mayan words which are the Atlantean origin, and in which is told the destruction of Atlantis and Lemuria. I refer you to Robert Ripley for confirmation of that. Our Christian Bible mentions the Great Deluge or Flood as having occurred a comparatively short time ago, whereas the records of the Chaldeans, from whom the Jewish people and the Hebrews derived their knowledge of the flood, place the time at what would today be approximately 52,000 years ago. Our geologists tell us that there was a great shaking and subsidence of a great part of the Earth's surface some 50,000 years ago. In the Amazon Valley of South America, there are remnants of vast cities and works of such a nature that only a great civilized race could have built them. It is recorded that in the Amazon Valley, through which the Amazon River now flows, there was once a vast inland sea, and with the great shaking of the earth, the lands began to rise, and the Andes mountains were pushed up, and the inland sea drained into the ocean. Thousands of feet up the Andes mountains, today there are still remnants of a vast civilization. They are of the hardest basalt and granite ever conceived of. One building still stands, and it is so eroded by time that every carving on it has entirely vanished. No archaeologist or scientist has ever attempted to explain that place, nor the origin of a great engineering work just outside of the ancient city, which is a canal large enough, wide enough, and originally deep enough for one of our big battleships to pass through. It is pushed up and goes over the mountains, and every few hundred feet it is broken and then goes on and up again. It was built before the Andes Mountains were raised up were raised above the level plain, and when the mountains were pushed up, this canal was pushed up with them. It is there today and can still be seen. We also know that in 1872 AD, when they opened up a mine there, they dug into the center of a hill and found a strange ship about 120 feet long. It had no sail, but it had a peculiar metal apparatus on it with strange lenses. When the air struck it, it fell into dust. I have in my notes a record of the exact date upon which it was found. That ship had been there perhaps 100,000 years. In Tibet, I have been star. In Tibet, I have seen star maps which were up to 5 million years old. Man has been on this earth for a long, long time. Civilizations have risen and fallen. The North and South Poles were once tropical countries. When we think of the antiquity of man and of the comparatively little that is known in modern times about ancient man, we sometimes wonder if man, as he is today, is the degenerated descendant of the great man, or is he man going upward again? We might say yes and no on that. Atlantis existed and sank 52,000 years ago. At that time, the world was in a very barbarous state, with the exception of the few colonies which were left by the Atlanteans. Very little culture and civilization existed because the continent of Lemuria had been almost destroyed some 500 years before the sinking of Atlantis. There were numerous barbarous strides in Africa, Asia, and in parts of North America. There were also certain great Atlantean colonies in certain parts of the world. One was in Ireland. They have stories of the Tuatha-De-Danann having strange powers now lost to man, who lived there once and ruled man. They had powers to change their shape and take any form they wished to. If anyone displeased them, they could play a tune on a pipe and the person would disintegrate. We are told that there came a time when they left their Ireland and went to some strange place of which they would not speak. But it was said that the time would come again when they would return. The Chaldeans had a perfect record that they had been civilized and had originated from an Atlantean colony. There is another Atlantean colony recorded in California beneath Mount Shasta, which is an extinct volcano. Mount Shasta was not a Lemurian colony. Atlantis existed for over 500,000 years. During that time, it was at the height of civilization and knowledge. They were developed and advanced in spiritual wisdom and unfoldment. Atlantis was a group of 10 islands ruled by 10 kings, which latter in legend became 10 circles alternately of land and water. The Azores in the Atlantic Ocean are a mountain peak of one of the ancient Atlantean islands. The Atlanteans had developed to great heights of civilization. They had learned all there was to know about the laws of nature, and they had become so civilized that there was established an absolute and perfect brotherhood amongst them. There was no poverty. They had everything that would make for absolute perfect material happiness. They had 10 islands and 10 rulers, and they had a ruler of all of these islands. They had a philosophical class and a scientific class, but they learned that the use of material laws was only a stepping stone to the knowledge of greater and higher laws. Finally, they became such a great spiritual race that the great ones among them began to pass closer to the spiritual sun, and their children were of a lower state of evolvement. They had great scientific powers and other vast powers at their beck and call, but they did not have the spiritual power to use them rightly. And it was when that happened that Atlantis was destroyed, because the people had begun to misuse the things which they had. It was destroyed so that the knowledge which they had could be removed from man. And when man incarnated again, it was in more barbarous races, and he had to begin again to climb the long ladder of life. Now I will speak of Lemuria. It was closely associated with Atlantis. Books to read: Atlantis, Antediluvian by Donnelly. History of Atlantis by Lewis Spence. From Norway, every year there is a certain little rodent called lemur, which leaves the land and begins to swim out into the ocean. It swims far out and then goes around and around in a circle and is finally drowned. It is an instinct in the animal to migrate to a land which must have once existed. Lemuria was in the Pacific Ocean. Its coastline off what is now the Malay Peninsula, like probably Malaysian, and the only extant parts of its landmass that are above the surface of the earth are the Caroline Islands in the South Pacific, and close to no large landmass except the Malay Peninsula. They belong today to Japan. Before the World War, they belonged to Germany. For the last 25 years, no Americans were allowed to go there. The Japanese, in working there, found buried 100,000 coffins in pure platinum. The Japanese, in working there, found buried 100,000 coffins in pure platinum, and they are using this platinum to finance their war. I don't know about that. I'd have to look into it. They are called the Nan Matal and are composed of 12 islands forming an almost perfect rectangle. Every one is based solidly around with basalt, with walls that rise 40 feet high, and some of the stones in the wall weigh as much as 30 and 40 tons. The stones are fitted together with no mortar, and yet are so solidly constructed that no sea water can get through. In some places there are steps leading up. Inside of the walls are the remnants of ancient temples. The Nan Matal and the surrounding islands are solidly covered with great buildings built of giant stones, in some of which are still some carvings. These buildings are so enormous that it has been estimated by competent archaeologists that the population of the area must have been somewhere between 4 and 1/2 and 5 million people. In other words, a city almost as large as London in an area of 2,000 square miles, where today there are less than 50,000 people, and today there is not enough land and food products raised in an area of 2,000 square miles to feed even a small part of the vast population which once must have inhabited that city. The Polynesians say that beneath one of these islands the sun god is sleeping, and that someday he will be awakened again and rule the world as he once did. It is said that the entrance to this underworld is found in the temple of the sun. God, the temple of the Son of God. At certain times of the month, when the moon is full, no Polynesian will approach, for during that time it is said that there comes up from below a sound of voices chanting, and there is a certain ritual, and if a person is on the island at that time, he is taken and never seen again. A number of white men have evidenced that there is such a sound coming up from below. The four who have known to stay during the full of the moon did not stay there the whole 3 nights. These Caroline Islands were known to the ancients as the mountain peaks of Lemuria. And on the mountain the great temples and cities are built. You can see the mountain down as far as you can look into the water, and divers have found buildings 150 feet down. It is said that it was once a city of more than 40 million people. We are told that it was from this particular place that the moon was born. The moon is a child of the earth. Before the earth became solidified, as it was whirling around in space, it cast off a part of itself, which became the moon. Many scientists believe that when that happened, it left a scar, a hollow space beneath, and this is the basis of the legend of the underworld with 8 entrances, and that there will come from there the Maitreya, king of the world, who will rule the world. When Lemuria existed above the surface of the world, it was a vast and wonderful country, and it had developed so far in scientific knowledge that it disturbed the Atlanteans, who had turned toward the spiritual. The Lemurians never had. They were a material nation. The Lemurians went further afield and established more colonies, and as a result they had considerable trouble with the Atlanteans, because in a few places where the Atlanteans had settled, the Lemurians came and there was trouble. These two nations existed side by side, one a great spiritual nation and the other a great material nation. Atlanteans had turned in their last days towards spiritual development, and the Lemurians had become very physical. The Lemurians were the Hitlers of their day. They worshipped the snake god. Before man came to Atlantis and Lemuria, these lands had been inhabited by a race which was not human. It was a strange race that had the body of a man but the head of a great serpent or snake. These beings were a hybrid manifestation, and they had hypnotic power and could cause the head to assume the form or even the features of any person they had desired. These snake people were almost totally destroyed by the Atlanteans and the Lemurians, but finally, through centuries and thousands of years, they began to appear again among the Lemurians, and there they established the worship of the snake and serpent. Through their power, they began to invade Atlantis, and they caused their serpent head to assume the form of Atlantean leaders, and it got so that the wise men of Atlantis searched out and discovered a word which the snake people could not pronounce. And every 6 months the rulers of the people were called before the people and told to pronounce the word which only human lips could pronounce. And thus the serpent worshippers would be revealed in their true light. The hypnotic illusionary power of the snake people is responsible for the legends which we now have of the little snake being able to hypnotize things. We are also told of a great temple on the islands of Atlantis which was ruled by the great person or by one great person or entity who in those times was called the Lord of Lords, and that he had existed since before the beginning of Atlantis. He was alive when Atlantis had its beginning, and he was alive when and he was alive when Atlantis had its beginning, and he was alive when Atlantis sank. So they're saying the Lord of Lords was on Atlantis, in the beginning and the end of Atlantis. He had manifested there for over 500,000 years, and he had power over all Atlantis, and it was he who led the Atlanteans onward and upward into a great spiritual nation. When Atlantis passed, he went elsewhere, as did many of the great race. In my book, The Emerald Tablets, there is a translation of the life of a great one, who left Atlantis when it sank and migrated to Egypt and founded the Egyptian race. This is Thoth, the builder of the Great Pyramid. Another thing about Lemuria, in Hawaii and among the Philippines, we have some record in the ancient writings of the Lemurian race who left tablets and images on Easter Island that were built by the Lemurians. The great power and mastery which Atlanteans had of the laws beyond and above the material laws caused Lemuria to sink. But that deluge was not the great deluge. The great deluge was the sinking. The great deluge was the sinking of Atlantis itself. When Lemuria sank, the ruling class and the snake priests fled into a space which they had prepared for themselves for tens of thousands of years. It was the place from which the moon had been cast forth. The Lemurians had lived under the ground as much as they lived over it. After the Lemurians had fled to that place, the Atlanteans sealed the entrance and placed a guard over it. That entrance is at the Sun Temple in the Caroline Islands. There is a story that from the top of Mount Shasta, periodically there is a great silver ship which flies over the Pacific. That ship goes to Nan Matau to inspect the seal where the Lemurians are imprisoned. Those souls who have not passed beyond the bondage of the wheel of life go to that place between incarnations and work to help bring the Lemurians to a state of spiritual consciousness to free them from their imprisonment. The Earth's surface has been changed 4 times in the past. Oklahoma and Texas were once a part of the ocean. Mexico has been up and down 3 times. And that is the end of the article by Doriel. And that is Article 2, Atlantis and Lemuria by Doriel, which basically told you about the Lemurian land, you know, where they're hidden, how Atlantis sank, and all that good stuff. And the difference between the Atlanteans and the Lemurians. Okay, the next is an interpretation of the Emerald Tablets by Doriel, with the 2 tablets not printed previously. Those 2 tablets that he's talking about are tablet 14 and 15, basically. If you go read on like Crystal Links, it'll say either tablet 14 or tablet 15. I forgot, but I know that these tablets, which are in the back of the book, are actually I don't remember if they're in the paperback version, but the version floating around on the internet, they are in there. Okay, so I'll probably end up reading those 3 tablets, those extra 2 tablets, in the form of separate videos, seeing I already did, you know, all the other 13 tablets, 12 or 13 tablets, in single video format. Okay, so instead, what I'm going to do, instead of reading the interpretations, I'm going to go ahead and make this a video purely with Doriel's articles on Atlantis in it. So I'm going to read the last article now that's in the book about Atlantis. And this is Atlantis and Its Part in the New Age by Dr. Doriel. After that, I will do the extra 2 tablets separately in different video format. And I will do the commentary on the tablets in a separate video. That sounds like a good idea to me. Okay, so Atlantis and Its Part in the New Age by Dr. Doriel. It may seem strange to some of you that we should connect Atlantis with the new and greater age which is to appear just around the corner. But if we know anything about occult traditions concerning Atlantis, we can see that there is a very important relationship between Atlantis and the New Age, because at the very height of its glory, Atlantis was in almost every respect just what we will find in the New Age. And when I say in almost every respect, quote unquote, he puts, I mean materially speaking and spiritually speaking, so far as concerns the evolvement and evolution of consciousness. It is true that the Atlanteans were far different in physical structure from what the finally perfected man will be. Yet their civilization at the height of their advancement was so great that what we call civilization today would seem like that of the most uncivilized race of savages on Earth today in comparison. That may seem like a very strong statement to make, yet if we realize that the Atlanteans had learned to do away with all the complicated machinery that utilized steam and electrical power, and even atomic power that we have today. Okay, let me reread this to you guys. Yet, if we realize that the Atlanteans had learned to do away with all the complicated machinery that utilized steam and electrical power and even atomic power that we have today and are just learning about, and that they had learned to utilize the subtle the subtle forces of nature, and either in the ether. In practically everything they did, that they had evolved a system of government that was almost completely perfect, that they had learned to place the ideals, the philosophy, the seeking of God above everything else that existed in the world. We can understand why there is a great relationship between Atlantis and the New Age. In this, I am going to give you some illustrations of Atlantis and the life in Atlantis so that you can get some glimmering, at least, of the things that lie before us. There is no actual illustrations in this article. He's talking about, like mental illustrations. Mental illustrations. Some people will say, but Atlantis is mythical. We have no written records of Atlantis. There are no books about Atlantis, excepting those written by men in our modern times. There are no records of that civilization, if civilization it was, excepting by Plato and one or two others. There are no contemporary records of Atlantis and its advancements excepting in folklore and mythology. My answer to that is very simple, that it has become a proven fact that prehistory is almost always recorded in the mythology and folklore of peoples. By study of folklore and mythology, it is possible to learn a great many things about ancient races and civilizations that have become completely lost by what we call practical historians. That we can learn a great deal about the ancient cultures and about the people that lived far beyond the dawn of recorded history. We know that according to Plato and the records we had access to, the sinking of Atlantis occurred 12,000 years ago before his time. Yet geology and other evidence shows us that it must have been at least 4 times since the sinking of that land mass once occupied the Atlantic Ocean. As a matter of fact, the Atlantic Ocean derived its name from Atlantis. As he said, man. In some of the early priestly accounts, Atlantis is mentioned, and we also know that there has been discovered in the past few years a tremendous amount of factual evidence to prove the existence of such a landmass. I am using the term landmass instead of saying island or continent. However, the oldest records say islands. I am speaking literally from the historical standpoint. For instance, we know that the Mayans themselves were not Atlanteans, but that their culture and knowledge of archaeology, of the stars, and of the mathematics had been taught them by people who had come somewhere from the Atlanteans. That we have learned because there has been some deciphering of early Mayan records. Most of you, I imagine, have heard of Le Plongeon because he wrote a number of books concerning the Mayans, Queen Mu, and the Egyptian Sphinx. Then there is one called Queen Mu's Talisman. Actually, I do not think he correctly translated many of them, it says. Nevertheless, he was the pioneer in that field. A great difficulty that we run into is when the Spaniards conquered the Mayas. Today there are only 6 known Mayan codexes or books, and peculiarly enough, one of those is written in the Greek alphabet. I mean that every letter of the Greek alphabet is found in the form of a poem which translated tells of the sinking of the motherland, cities being drowned, and people finally leaving and migrating to other places. So there is also a number of other evidence. I was looking at an old National Geographic some time ago, and it showed a stone, and over it was a little subtitle. "This stone is from Atlantis," read the subtitle. It did not make any explanation of that the stone is from Atlantis. We know also that Egypt had the legend that their country had been settled by Atlanteans. We have considerable evidence that ancient Iran was once a colony of ancient Atlantis. As a matter of fact, there is all the difference in the world between mythology and fairy tales. A myth tells in story form, sometimes highly exaggerated things which sometimes appear fantastic, but after a while you begin to find there are certain common factors that run throughout all of them, and then another factor, and after a while you have a picture, and finally you can come out with something you can lay your hands on. That is one reason I have collected around 800 volumes of folklore and mythology. I have not done so because I need that to prove that Atlantis existed, but merely what I like to discover the factual things that remain to us in story form. It is like the Old Testament. Some parts are factual, some are mythological, but the mythological ones do carry an account of some belief, some tradition that the Jewish people once had. So he's basically saying, guys, that he collected mythological and folklore books because he wanted to learn all the different tales, all the different fairy tales and folk tales, and, you know, beliefs and stories of different traditions, like the deluge, which, like he said, is in a lot of holy books, but deeper, it's a mythological, allegorical metaphor for Atlantis. You know, sinking. Okay, so now coming down to Atlantis. Atlantis sank approximately 50,000 years ago. That was the time when the deluge or flood that we read about in the Bible took place. Whether we believe it or not, the biblical account of the flood or of Noah was one not of Jewish or Hebrew origin, but they borrowed, like the Jews of Egypt did when they left Egypt, from the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans had many legends, and they were embodied in books formed of clay. They were bound after the particular characters had been inscribed on them, and the Chaldean accounts tell of the deluge and in different form, of course, from the Jewish account in the Old Testament, but after all, they took the story and placed it around their own culture. And I will say that many of the book religions are very eclectic and do take from different sources. The Chaldeans said that long ago, at a period they placed at about 50,000 years ago, they said that the gods looked down at earth and saw man and saw man had become evil. He had become proud, his cities reached into the sky, he gained great knowledge and great wisdom, but he had lost his respect for the gods. So the gods met at a council, and they tried to destroy man by water, but one of the gods, Ea, the god of the water, the god of the ocean, of the sea or ocean, had one man that he loved. This man had always been a very good man. One of the very few, and EA again, wanted to tell this man so he could save himself, but the gods themselves promised they would not tell it to any living man. So I whispered it to the reeds, and as this man was walking through the reeds whispered it to the man and told him what to do to save himself. So he built a great ark, and into it he took animals two by two, and his sons and daughters, and when the water came and drowned the earth, he was saved. That story was old in Chaldea before the period set in the Old Testament for the deluge. They came along, put Noah in it, and said it was one of their ancestors that did it, which is alright, but that just shows you how stories grow and become started. I do not doubt that the Chaldeans got the story from somebody else. Maybe the people of the sea, and nobody knows who they were, where they came from, or anything about them. I have a very unusual statue that no one has ever seen anything like. It shows two figures standing on the bank with water proceeding from it after the deluge, holding the Krakon, the god of space. The story unquestionably originated, as did that of the story of the deluge, among the peoples of all the widely scattered lands of earth, and the sinking of Atlantis, because with such a vast area of land as comprised Atlantis, there had to be a various sinking of land and raising of others. That always rather amused me when we read the Bible. I am sorry, but I do not believe the Bible from cover to cover, the author goes on to say. A lot of the old things in the Old Testament are myth. It shows when the deluge came and only Noah and his daughters were safe, and I read in the Chaldean records where a war was fought 60 years after the deluge in which 3 million men took part. I will be doggoned if I believe Noah had 3 million grandsons in 60 years. In other words, the story basically may be true, but the time element is out of balance, and that is the way of many things. We have to study contemporary history as well as mythology to find out whether things are in proper sequence. Atlantis sank about 50,000 years ago. At that time, the time of the sinking, scattered over the face of the earth there were numerous tribes of barbarous and savage men. Only on two continents, or rather on two land masses, one a continent and one a group of large islands, some very large, there were two great civilized nations, the Lemurians on one continent and the Atlanteans on all the islands. All the rest of the world, with the exception of a few scattered colonies that had been established in different parts of the world, the entire world was composed of savage and barbarous races and tribes. Unquestionably, most of the people of Earth today, there are exceptions, of course. Unquestionably, most of the people of Earth today, there are exceptions, of course, are descended from savage and barbarous tribes that were left after the deluge, because after the deluge there were only comparatively few Atlanteans left. Though it is true the Atlantean strain has come down through the ages almost pure into the present time, yet such are very, very rare. I think that in an entire life I have met two persons that were descended without a break on both sides from the original families that were left after the deluge. It may be of interest to you to know that all the Atlanteans know each other. Even at the time of the sinking of Atlantis, there was a great degeneration of the Atlanteans. Now the Atlanteans came into being as a nation or nations some 500,000 years before its sinking. When I say came into being as a nation, I mean that before that time the ancestors who became the Atlanteans were in themselves in comparatively uncivilized and savage state. very little more advanced than the people are here in America today. And will anybody deny that people are uncivilized and savages today with 2 wars and getting all ready to do it again? I mean, it's just like what it sounds like today. Do you call that civilization? Nothing was ever settled by wars. People have to learn that there are other ways of doing things than by force. That is the first beginning of civilization in the individual or the nation, when they learn that there are many ways of doing things than by force. When warring nations are living side by side with one civilized nation, has to learn to protect itself. The Atlanteans knew how to do that. I wish the people in the world today knew as much as the Atlanteans, he says. The prehistoric Atlanteans came into a group of islands, very large islands, even the smallest that afterwards became known as Atlantis, a time of approximately 500,000 years before its sinking. When they came into the Atlantean islands, they found them inhabited by a race of people that were not human, and yet I use the term people advisedly because they had intelligence. They had knowledge, mental powers surpassing the people of their time, and certainly the people of this present time. Those people had physically evolved in a line of evolution different from that of humankind. They had evoluted from the serpent who walked upright like a man. When the Atlanteans fought the serpent people, they had a very hard time in their battle with them. The serpent people desperately fought against the invaders. The Atlanteans who came in were not all of the same race. They were of various races who had joined together in combination or union. They had learned to form a permanent union of cooperation of a group of scattered nations and races, and the original Atlanteans were of a different number of races. There were the red race. The copper-skinned race is not derived entirely from the red Atlantean race. There was a white race, there was a yellow race, and gold race. I might mention just in passing that the Osage Indian tribe was from, that is, its parent stock was formed from an admixture of the yellow, gold, and one of the prehistoric savage races. That is, of course, after the sinking of Atlantis, and the Osage Indians still have definite characteristics of those races. There was also a black race, the Negro race. They had the same hair, very finely cut features, and were completely related to the so-called Negro race. And there also were 2 races that have no counterpart on Earth today. There was a blue race and a green race. All of those took part in the original invasion and taking of the Atlantean island group and fought the serpent people. That is one reason in the legends of every land and nation we find stories of the serpent race that contended with mankind in his beginning, because so far as even our legendary history goes, it only goes back to the Atlantean race. In certain islands in the Pacific, the culture and remnants of the most ancient races are under the ocean. They fought the serpent people, and the serpent people walked upright like a man. They had a body covered with fine scales, and their head was like that of a tremendously great snake, and and their mouth was just about that wide, and they had a certain mental power that the race of man did not have at that time and does not have today, except in a few isolated instances. That was hypnotic power. They could assume the form of anything they could cast a hypnotic spell on, and then the serpent struck. That is the reason even that statement in the Bible, and woman was given the power to bruise the serpent's head with her heel, and the serpent who tempted man in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve became a symbol of mankind, and Adam and Lilith became the symbol of the tempter, and Adam married Eve and was tempted by Lilith, and Lilith was the first wife of Adam. That is left out of the Bible, but is found in Jewish legend. After the passing of many centuries, those who became Atlanteans were firmly settled, and they had killed out the majority of the serpent people, but there were still a few hundred of them that lived, and they injected themselves into various places, and they remained hidden through long periods of ages, but they did form an underground that constantly fought against the advancement of Atlantis. Atlantis became very great mentally and spiritually, and shall we say, occultly speaking, because they learned to utilize all the powers of the etheric currents and etheric forces, so they used them not just in occult practices, but in their everyday life. To give you an example, they learned how to build without hands. I have sometimes wondered if, in spite of the stories in the Bible of all the gold and wood and things Solomon put in his temple, if Solomon had learned or found one of the etheric producing machines of Atlantis and built his temple without the sound of hammer. I have always been rather curious about that, and to satisfy my curiosity, I went back in time to the time of the building Solomon's temple, and I found, sure enough, he had discovered one of the Atlantean building machines, and that he started in to use it. He built a model of his temple, turned on the power wrong, and it did not build, but he still had a vision, a dream, and then went ahead and built the temple after the model he had found of this machine. Let me describe that machine to you as simply as I can. They did not have to build their temples or houses, not with metals or wood or stone or even with their hands. I lost my place, just a minute. Okay, the only workshops that the Atlanteans had was workshops of producing miniatures, a few factories where they would turn out in miniature little figures of everything they wanted. If they were going to build a city, they would pick out a site, then construct in miniature all the things they wanted for it, using gold, silver, wood, or whatever it might be. Then that was placed in a certain machine they had. Then two crystals were focused on the point they wanted that building to appear. It would not build beyond a certain range or point, but they would focus that on a certain point. The miniature was in a certain chamber, and then the operator, who was one that was specially trained, one of the guild of builders who would seat himself before the machine, before that machine. He would pour into a certain he would pour into it a certain mental impulse, and he would cause to flow through his body, and through that machine a stream of certain etheric currents. There were and are 12 basic etheric energies or currents, and in Atlantis the men were all, and some women, organized into guilds. Not like our modern labor unions, but in guilds, and each one because of certain peculiar qualities they had, was able to control the flow of one. Okay, it says, alright. Okay, there were and are 12 basic etheric energies or currents, and in Atlantis the men were all, and some women, organized into guilds. Not like our modern labor unions, but in guilds, and each one, because of certain peculiar qualities they had, was able to control the flow of one of those 12 subsidiary subdivisions of etheric currents more completely than any other person. The Guild of Builders, all those people were born under a certain sign and could flow it's somewhere here, guys. Okay, the Guild of Builders, for instance, all those people were born under a certain sign and could control those powers better than anyone else. They started that flowing, then this machine, which was simply a series of coils built around a central coil formed of two metals, one red and one kind of silvery gray in color, natural metals found in Atlantis, but not known on Earth today. Though at one time the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid was lined with two metals, through a series of coils, and these coils were not formed of wire. I mentioned that in case you try to wire a coil. These themselves have been built by another guild. Those coils were coils of energy. They built energy patterns or webs that remained static in their place, and they knew so much about the forces of nature they were able to build a force shield and maintain it around. Now when this current poured through it, also poured through these coils and sent it into the facsimile, which was projected, and they were centered at one point, and where those beams came to a focal point, a building grew an exact facsimile of the miniature, and it grew in proportion to the dimensions that had been embodied in the miniature. If the miniature was 1/4 of an inch high and 1/2 inch long, they could estimate the size of the rooms or building. So building of an Atlantean city was no arduous task. In the latter days of the Atlantean city that had been built by hands was one where the priestly class and the philosopher class met, because that was the first city built on Atlantean islands, and it was kept more as the form of a museum of antiquity than anything else. But the same was true of everything that they did. All the things they did when they made their ships that would fly around the air, etc., they were all made in the same manner. A moment ago I told about how and why they were divided into 12 guilds. To explain that, I have to explain something about the calendar system. They divided their years through 12 months of 30 days each, and then every fourth year the one that was 29 had 30 days, so they actually had 13 months instead of 12 months we have now. As a matter of fact, I don't know whether you realize it now, but every so many hundred years we lose so much time. They learned this, that if a person was born under a particular sign and they had 13 signs instead of 12 signs that we now have in the zodiac, They had 13 signs, not 12, and the 13 signs, each of them had a greater ability to manipulate certain of the etheric forces than the others. They could all manipulate all of them, but some seem to have a greater power because they were born under the same sign. I will not say related or attuned to that particular division of the etheric powers. I said there were 12 guilds, so 12 of the signs which are familiar to our signs that we know now. As a matter of fact, astrology originated in Atlantis, and later it became transformed. One sign was lost, and we came to have 12 signs, but the 12 signs could control these powers. There was a 13th sign, a controlling or directing sign, and those born under that sign from that time of their birth were trained for coordinating and correlating all of the others. When Atlantis sank and was destroyed, the coordinators passed, and there was no longer any use of for that knowledge. It could not be utilized. The Atlanteans had gained certain powers. They had gained the power to move through space, not through unlimited distances, but they could move through space as far as the moon, and for a time there were certain colonies established on the moon. They moved to the moon not through spaceships, but through a vibration of the same ability that they built their buildings with. They could use that as a projector, and where they focused the rays from it, an object placed in a disintegrating chamber, reassembled at the point they were focused. They were focused. That was the common method of transportation in Atlantis at the height of its glory before it fell. There were few cars driven by subetheric energies that moved on the surface, and quite a number of planes built according to the principles I have here. As long ago they were propelled along magnetic currents. A long time ago they were propelled along magnetic currents, and they were propelled along magnetic currents, and they were able to move very fast, very rapidly. As a matter of fact, if I am not mistaken, these flying discs that they have seen are a variation of those that the Atlanteans used. I wonder if any of you read in the paper some time ago. I wonder if any of you read in the paper some time ago about that ship those two airline pilots saw. It had two decks with windows brilliantly lighted and shooting a fire about 40 feet, and they were so blinded by the flare or light from it that they had to turn on their instrument lights, moving somewhere between 500 and 700 miles an hour, and went right on up. If I am not mistaken, we do not have to worry about that being a Russian ship. Ha ha. Some of our neighbors needed some material and came down and got it, but they have been doing that for a long time. For a long time, they have been coming down and getting things out of the sea, but they did not want to bother us or let us know about it because we are too uncivilized. There are marvelous things just at hand, and we cannot see them because we are blinded by our negation, and it will be wonderful when we begin to see people begin to grow into their true estate. If they wanted to visit one of their friends on the other side of the city, they did not walk or ride because each house had one chamber in it that was fixed, another variation of the building instrument and of the projecting instrument for long distance travel. All they would have to do is set its dial on the number. Those for long distance projections were held in certain places and not open to the public, but they had a system just like our telephone system. Dial a number and come out in a chamber of the other, shall we say, telephone. A curious and easy method of transportation. Atlanteans knew some things we are just beginning to learn something about. They knew that the individual ego was not bound or hindered by the body, and the human body itself was just a certain pattern held in form by certain forces. Disassociate its elements, and the pattern then was projected along one etheric wave, which could also carry the astral structure of the body. It had to carry two things, the astral structure and the physical pattern of the body. When a person passed that way, their whole body actually was disintegrated into nothingness, but each pattern of these bodies was consistently pouring forth a stream of radiation which passed from one machine to another and arrived instantly. That pattern picked up the elements necessary, assembled them, and the body formed. Though they did not look any different yet, every time they went from place to place, it was an entirely different body. Stepped down, that became the basis of all the great discoveries of Atlantis. They learned that basically the human body became deceased because there were certain destructions in the basic pattern of the human body, and it would get this malignant growth or that dysfunction, or they would be afflicted with a broken bone or what have you. So their medicine and system of healing eliminated the physical body entirely. They did not pay any attention to the physical body. They began to study the basic pattern. They learned to take the human body. Perhaps something had gone wrong. Perhaps some disease had started. The doctor would put them under a certain machine, something like the X-ray, excepting when they looked into it, they did not see the skeleton. They looked through that and were able to see the flow of etheric currents that formed the body, and they could see where a distortion in that. Okay, they looked through that and were able to see the flow of etheric currents that formed the body, and they could see where there was a distortion in that pattern. Then they would manipulate them until they would straighten out the distorted physical pattern. Then they would put the person in a machine, transport them from one place to another, and then they would leave out the disease pattern and reintegrate the elements. And when they came out with the pattern that had been corrected. A person once told me that every great natural healer, there are such things as great natural healers, that regardless of the methods used, the person is healed in time. Said that every one of those persons, the healers, would by direction of consciousness, and when they would heal, would correct or straighten out the pattern in the body of the person they were healing. But in such a case, it took time. Whereas when the Atlanteans did it, they just blew them up here and reassembled them up here with a new body that matched the pattern. In other words, there was no such thing as a disease or sickness allowed to remain except for a short period of time in any person in Atlantis. So the Atlanteans lived to a very great age. Thousands of years was nothing for Atlanteans to live. Finally, the physical body did die, not because they could not conquer disease, but because the basic pattern would break down under certain poisonous emanations from the sun, and when that happened, there was nothing they could do about that. I might say this, that exactly those same things will be a part of the new age. Is coming to. Okay, I might say this, that exactly those same things will be a part of the new age is coming to us. In other words, there will be no more sickness, no more disease, and there will finally come a time when there will be no more death. When we read in the Bible about the men who lived to be 1,000 years old, or 4 or 5,000 years, there must have been something which enabled those men to live to those vast ages. Perhaps they were in contact with some of those raised descendants of the Atlantean continents, but unquestionably their knowledge and power exceeding others, anything that we even dream about today. That is the reason I say that they were civilized, because they did not fight among themselves. I am not talking about the last days of Atlantis, though. They considered there was an overspirit which was the source of emanation, and that the immaterial form covering the spiritual was beneath the material. That way sound like a peculiarly phrased statement. They believed in the magnetic principle in universal creation, in the electrical principle, but those were merely the basic or minor applications of force and power. They knew the power of the infinite mind manifested in time, space, and light, and they knew and used the developing principle in universal creation. They had early learned one basic fact, that nothing existed without an infinite center, and that infinite center has its counterpart in the world of man. Therefore they began early to seek the counterpart in man. They looked within from the very beginning instead of without for the source of their powers. They considered it to be very crude to have to use any form of material force or energy to bring about force for the things they wanted. Sometimes they built instruments, but they used them only as a channel because they had learned to tap the universal currents and tap them at will. There was no sickness and no disease, and death was something they put off until practically they were ready to pass anyway. But their bodies were still strong, and they would walk into special places set aside for that purpose and break up their physical and die. When they had completed what they wanted to do and were ready to go on into a greater and higher thing, they went. They were not afraid of death and put off their physical bodies at will. They did not conceive there was such a thing as death, and went through transitions at will, but not in the sense of committing suicide. They merely laid down one vehicle to pick up another, and they carried on for a great time, but they finally reached a point where all the souls that had originally inhabited Atlantis had become so great, spiritually speaking, that they no longer needed to incarnate in a physical body and passed. But those who passed had children. For a long period of time, the souls that came into the bodies of the children had come from other planets, with souls that were lower in development, so low in fact that though physically they had inherited certain powers, they did not have the spiritual evolution in harmony with it, so they would and could use those powers constructively. And so when that happened, the time came for them to pass, and when those lesser souls that came after, people about like us or less, And when they began to use powers destructively, the Great Ones decided they must pass. So those physical powers could be taken away, and they would reincarnate in places where the weapons they could use and the powers they had would be in accordance with their own particular evolvement at that time. Men had powers besides which the atom bomb is a child's firecracker. So the Great Ones and Ones decided that Atlantis should be destroyed, so they changed the balance of the earth and water rolled in. Lands sank and other lands rose, and Atlantis was destroyed. But before they did that, they had sent certain things to other lands, so those records were preserved, still are preserved, so those who have gone into the mysteries and permeated into the secret places have been able to see in operation as well as just the things they had. People say, why don't they give them to the world today? Why should they give them to another world that is even less worthy? When we become ready, the knowledge and powers will become ours, and that time will be in the golden age. But that is the reason man must evolve spiritually. That is the reason we have to create a golden age within ourselves. And so that is the final article by Doriel in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. As you can see, I am a stud and can go for hours. However, I'm going to take a break. That's right, hours. Alright, so yeah, that's the completion of Atlantis and its part in the New Age by Doriel. And I just read you the other two articles and whatnot. I will be back with commentary, and then, yeah. But for now, I'm just going to take a break. Very tired. But I can go even further.